Today we are reading the sixth book in the Left, no, it's the seventh book in the Left Behind series. The name of this book is Indwelling, and I am going to be reading chapter 5 today. Thank you for joining me, and I'll begin to read now. Chloe felt silent at the news. Tyson might have predicted tears, disbelief, railing against someone other than her father. She just sat, shaking her head. Difficult as it had been to inform her, Tyson was oddly still reeling from what to him had felt almost like an out of body experience while praying. He had heard of those and pooh poohed them as fabrications or drug induced hallucinations on deathbeds. But this sensation, so real and dramatic that it had temporarily derailed his empathy and intercession on Rayford's behalf, was something else again. He had long advocated checking experience against Scripture and not the other way around. He would, he realized, have to remind himself of that frequently until the glow, which seemed too positive a word for the disturbing residue of the incident, receded into memory. A verse from the Old Testament teased his consciousness, and his mind wandered from the troubled young woman before him. As Chloe had not yet responded, Tyson said, "Excuse me a moment, please," and brought his whole Bible text up onto his laptop screen. A few seconds later, he clicked on Joel 2. He silently read verses 28 through 32, finding that he had been led to a passage that both illuminated his experience and might provide some balm to her as well. "I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. And also on my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my spirit in those days. And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be deliverance, as the Lord has said, among the remnant whom the Lord calls." Tyson looked up with a start when Chloe spoke at last. He detected no trauma in her voice, nothing that would have given away that she had just learned that her father was the most wanted fugitive in the world, except for her words themselves. "I should have seen it coming," she said. "He tried to divert me to Hattie, which wasn't hard. She never had any qualms about saying she wanted to kill Carpathia." Tyson cleared his throat. Why would he do it? Knowing the death wound is only temporary anyway. Is your father capable of such an act? Chloe stood and peeked into the other room, where she was apparently satisfied with whatever Kenny was doing with his food. "I wouldn't have thought so until recently," she said. "He changed so much, almost as dramatically as the difference in him before and after the rapture. It was as if he had reverted into something worse than he had been before he became a believer." Tyson cocked his head and sneaked a glance at the television. "Nothing new. I was aware of tension in the house," he said, "but I missed what you're talking about." "The rage. You missed the rage?" Tyson shrugged. "I share some of that. I still fight it when I think of my family." His voice caught. "I know, Tyson, but you have been a man of the Scripture your whole life. This is new to Daddy. I can't imagine him actually standing there and doing it, but I'm sure he wanted to. If he did, it sure answers a lot of questions about where he's been and what he's been doing." "Oh, Tyson, how will he get away? That they say he's at large makes me wonder if it's not just a lie, a smear campaign to make him, you, and us look bad. Maybe he's a scapegoat. We can only hope." She dropped into a chair. "What if he's guilty? What if he's a murderer? There's no exception to God's law if the victim is the Antichrist, is there? Tyson shook his head. None that I know of. Then mustn't he turn himself in, suffer the consequences? Slow down, Chloe. We know too little. But if he is guilty, my answer may surprise you. Surprise me? Off the top of the head, I believe we are at war, in the heat of battle. Killing the enemy has never been considered murder. But I told you I might surprise you. I personally would harbor your father from the GC if he shot Carpathia dead, even while urging him to seek God about himself. You're right, Chloe said. You surprised me. David watched Annie work from the corner of the hangar where Mac and Abdullah met him. What's that smell? He said. Yeah, Mac said, looking at Abdullah. What is that? Abdullah shrugged, then held up an index finger. Oh, I remember now, Captain, he said. Your idea. I'm listening, Mac said. Abdullah pulled a pungent pita sandwich from his pocket. Hungry, anyone? He said. Here's hoping I'll never be that hungry, David said, pointing to a trash barrel 20 feet away. Abdullah hit it with a hook shot, and somehow the thing didn't fly apart in the air. Mac shook his head. Next, you're going to tell me you were an Olympic basketball player. Missed the trials, Abdullah said. Active duty. David caught Mac's "What did I tell you" look. So, Ab, Mac said, are you pout because you never finished your dinner? Abdullah looked away as if knowing he was being teased but not catching the whole drift. If I am pout, he said, it is because I am exhausted and want to go to bed. Is anyone sleeping around here? It seems everyone is about. Go, David said. Don't make it obvious, but go to bed. I'm going to be good for nothing if I don't crash sometime soon, too. Abdullah slipped away. You look whipped, too, Mac, David said. Mac nodded for David to follow him to his office across the hall from Annie's. They're making a big deal about finding Rayford's fingerprints on a saber, Mac said as he settled into the chair behind his desk. But who knows if he was even there? I'll find out by listening in. I think I already did. The print trace, at least what they said about it on the plane, sounded legit. Israeli-based peacekeepers found the weapon, bagged it, and immediately lifted prints and started comparing it against the global database. The only reason it took as long as it did was because they tested it against criminals first and against the former GC employee list last. But the funny thing is that nobody's talking about Rayford as a perpetrator. David flinched. When they've got him dead to rights. Mac showed both palms. They must know something we don't know. Such as? Well, Neon Leon has a bee in his bonnet for the 3 disloyal regional postings. He keeps talking about a conspiracy. I mean, everybody hears a gunshot and heads for the hills. People jump off the stage. Carpathia is down and dying. The suspected weapon is found with a disgruntled former employee's prints all over it, and all Leon can talk about is a conspiracy. What does that tell you? David frowned and furrowed his brow. That the shooter missed? Mac expelled a resigned breath through his nose. That's my theory. If it was so cut and dry, why don't they call Rayford the shooter? In public, they do. But in private, they're still looking. David, something stinks here. David heard Annie's office door and looked out through the blinds. She was doing the same, and he invited her over with a wave. She held up a finger and motioned that she had to make a call first. When she finally joined them, they brought her up to date. You still planning on listening in to the autopsy, she said. David nodded. Maybe you ought to patch into the evidence room, too. Didn't know we had one. We do now. They've cordoned off a section under the amphitheater. Lots of room, lots of light. Are you sure? That's next to where they've got Guy Blood fashioning a 24-foot Carpathia statue. That's where I delivered the evidence. 2 plastic bags, 1 wood crate. Hickman's got a crew of forensic experts scheduled for 10 this morning. David looked at his watch. It is tomorrow already, isn't it? Well, look like everything's happens then, autopsy and all. Guess both sides need sleep first. I heard they're trying to start the viewing at dawn Sunday, Annie said. That's tomorrow. Bedtime, kids, David said. Rayford felt grimy and groggy. Despite his fear and the knowledge that his life as a fugitive has escalated 1,000 times over, he was buoyed by his eagerness to pray and to get back into the Bible. Maybe it was naive to think he could elude the GC for long. His recklessness had probably cost him his hope for surviving until the glorious appearing. Even forgiven sin, he had learned, has its consequences. He just hoped he hadn't jeopardized the entire tribulation force, or worse, saints worldwide. As he sat praying in the dust 50 yards off the road, the night air dried the sweat on his head and neck and chilled him. In his fatigue and misery, he still felt closer to God than he had for months. His phone chirped, and Rayford hoped against hope it would be someone from the tribulation force, ideally Chloe or Buck. It was Laszlo's. Are you in place? Affirmative. And you are? Marvin Berry, Rayford said. Check, Laszlo said. We were at a spot about 2 kilometers back where we could see the entire stretch of the road before us. There appears to be no other traffic. You should hear us inside 30 seconds and see our lights soon. Start moving toward the road as soon as you hear us. We will open the back door as we stop, and as soon as you are in and it is shut, we will turn around quickly and head north again. Gotcha. Repeat. No. Okay. Eager to be in the presence of a friend and fellow believer, Rayford was almost giddy under the circumstances. He slapped his phone shut, then opened it again to try one more time to reach anyone long distance. When it was obvious he still could not, he rang off and realized he heard a vehicle. He began jogging toward the road, but something was wrong. Unless he was turned around, it sounded as if the car was coming from the south. Should he dial Laszlo's back and see if he had misunderstood? But how could he have? Potamus was north. The church had to be north. Surely Laszlo's had said he would be heading south. The engine sounded much bigger than a small car's. Rayford skidded to a stop in the loose dirt, realizing he had nowhere to hide if a vehicle came upon him from the south, and it was becoming obvious that one was. It was loud, and it was big, and it was coming fast, but he saw lights only on the northern horizon. That had to be Laszlo's. The bigger vehicle from the south would reach him first. Regardless who it was, they would likely stop to check out a walking stranger. Rayford spun frantically, looking for somewhere to hide. His shirt was light-colored and might be detectable in the darkness. As the sound rushed toward him, Rayford dove face first to the ground, pulling his dark bag atop his back as he lay there. With his free hand, he popped open his phone to warn Laszlo's to abort and keep going. But when he hit redial, he got the long-distance attempt again and realized he didn't even have Laszlo's cell number. He prayed Laszlo's would see the oncoming vehicle in time to keep from slowing and pulling off the road. Rayford's phone rang. Yeah? What is coming from the south with no lights? I don't know, Laszlo's. I'm on the ground. Keep going just in case. The vehicle flew past and Rayford felt the rush of the wind. He tried to get a look at the car, but could determine only that it was a Jeep-like. That could have been GC, he said into the phone. It was, Laszlo said. Stay right where you are. It doesn't appear they saw you. They will be able to see us behind them for miles, so don't move. We will come back when we feel it is safe. I'd feel safer back in the foliage, Rayford said. Better wait. They might be able to see movement. We will see if other GC vehicles are coming. Why are they speeding around without lights? We have no idea, Laszlo said. Buck couldn't remember the name of the place, but it was one spot he and Chaim had been together where no one would expect to see either of them. It took an hour to find an empty cab, and he was informed that any ride, regardless of distance, would cost 100 nicks. Buck described the place to the driver and told him the general area. The man nodded slowly, as if it was coming to him. I think I know place, or some like it. All work same when you want get. How do the Westerners say medicated? That's what I want, Buck said, but I have to find the right place. We try, the driver said. Many closed, but some still open. They rolled over curbs, around crumbled buildings, through dark traffic lights, and past accident scenes. The cabbie stopped at two bars that seemed to be doing land office business, considering, but Buck recognized neither. It's about the same size as this one. Big neon sign in the window. Narrow door, that's all I remember. I know place, the man said. Closed. Want these or other place? I want the other one. Take me there. I know it closed. Closed weeks. He held up both hands as if Buck didn't understand. Nobody there, dark. Bye-bye. That's where I want to go, Buck said. Why you want to go where it's closed? I'm meeting someone. She won't be at closed place, he said, but he drove off anyway. See, he said, slowing at mid-block nearby, it's closed. Buck paid him and hung around the street until the cab left, the driver shaking his head. He soon realized he was in sheer darkness, trees blotting out the clouds, and far enough from the emergency action that no lights were visible. The cab lights had shown that the earthquake had leveled several buildings on the street. It was clear now that the power was out in the area. Would Chaim have come here? Could he have? They had come here looking for Jacob the night he had become a believer. Chaim convinced he would be at his favorite bar, drunk as usual. They had found him there all right, and most assumed he was drunk. He was on the tabletop, preaching to his old friends and drinking buddies. Buck was fast losing faith. If Chaim was alive, if he had been able to find someone to cart him around, how long would he have stayed on a deserted, dark, destroyed street? And was there really any hope that they might both have thought of that obscure establishment? Buck pulled the flashlight from his pocket and looked around before it occurred to him that Chaim would not likely be in sight, at least until he was certain that it was Buck with the light. And how would Chaim know that? Buck stood in front of the closed bar and shined the light on his own face. Almost immediately he heard a rustle in the branch of a tree across the street and the clearing of a throat. He quickly aimed the beam at the tree, prepared to retreat. Hanging out from under one of the leafy branches was a pajama leg, completed by a stocking and slippered foot. Buck kept the faint beam on the bewildering scene, but as he moved slowly across the street, the foot lifted out of sight. The lower branch bent with the weight of the tree dweller, and suddenly down he came, agile as a cat. Standing there before Buck in slippers, socks, pajamas, and robe was a most robust Chaim Rosenzweig. Cameron, he said, his voice strong and clear. This is almost enough to make a believer out of me. I knew you'd come. Another unlit GC vehicle raced past while Rayford lay in the dirt. All he could think of was the prodigal son, realizing what he had left and eager to get back to his father. When the pre-dawn grew quiet again, Rayford forsook caution and dashed for the underbrush. He was filthy and tried to brush himself off. Laszlo and his pastor had to have seen the other GC vehicle and were playing it safe. 40 minutes later, which seemed like forever to Rayford, a small white four-door slid to a stop in the gravel. Rayford hesitated. Why had they not called? He looked at his phone. He had shut it off, and apparently the battery was too low to power the wake-up feature. The back door opened. Laszlo's called, Mr. Barry, and Rayford ran toward the car. As soon as the door was shut, Laszlo spun a U-turn and headed south. I don't know where the GC is going, but I'll go the other way for now. Demetrius has a friend in the country nearby. A brother? Of course. Demetrius, Rayford said, extending his hand to the passenger. Rayford still, call me Ray. The younger man had a fierce grip and pulled Rayford until he could reach to embrace him. Demetrius, Demeter, he said. Call me Demetrius or brother. Tyson was moved and took comfort in the verse that reminded him that during the period of cosmic history, God would pour out his spirit, and that your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. The question was whether he was an old man or a young man. He decided on the former and attributed what he had felt on the floor to his drowsiness. He had apparently lost consciousness while praying and nearly slipped into a dream. If the dream was from God, he prayed he would return to it. If it was merely some sleep-deprived fancy, Tyson prayed he would have the discernment to know that too. That the passage had gone on to reference the heavenly wonders and blood, fire, and smoke the world had already experienced also warmed Tyson. He had been an eyewitness when the sun had been turned into darkness and the moon into blood. He read the passage to Chloe and reminded her, "This is before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord." I believe that refers to the second half of the tribulation, the great tribulation, which starts now. Chloe looked at him unexpectedly. But, oh dear one, the best is yet to come. I don't believe it was coincidence that the Lord led me to this passage. Think of your father and our compatriots overseas when you hear this. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be deliverance, as the Lord has said, among the remnant whom the Lord calls. You know who the remnant is, don't you, Chloe? The Jews. Yes, and in Zion, which is Israel, and Jerusalem, where we know some of your own were, if they call upon the Lord, they will be delivered. Chloe, I don't know how many of us, or if any of us, will survive until the glorious appearing, but I am claiming the promise of this passage because God prompted me to find it. Because God prompted me to find it, that our beloved will all return safely to us this time. In spite of everything, in spite of everything. Is there anything in there that says when the phones will start working again? Leah Rose had landed in Baltimore and pondered her next moves. Finding Hattie Durham in North America was like pawing through the proverbial haystack for a needle someone else had already found. The GC was on Hattie's trail and clearly hoped she would lead them to the lair of the Judites. If Leah could get her phone to work, she could call T at Palwaukee and see if the Super J plane she had heard so much about was still at the airport and ready for use. On the other hand, if she could get through to T, she could have gotten through to the safe house and sent them running. Did she dare fly commercially to Illinois and rent a car under her alias? She had no other choice. Unable to communicate except locally, her only hope was to beat Hattie to Mount Prospect. Finding the woman and persuading her to mislead the GC was just too much to hope for. How close can you get me to Gary, Indiana? Leah asked at the counter after waiting nearly a half hour for the one airline clerk. Hammond is the best I can do, and that would be very late tonight. Having misled the young man about her destination, she switched gears. How about Chicago? O'Hare and Mike still closed? And Midway, the clerk said. Kankakee any help? Perfect, she said. When? If we're lucky, you'll be on the ground by midnight. If we're lucky, Leah said, that'll mean the plane landed and didn't crash. The man did not smile, and Leah remembered, we don't do luck. David lay in bed with his laptop, knowing he would soon nod off, but pursuing again the abandoned buildings and areas in the northern Illinois that might provide a new safe house for the stateside tribulation force. The whole of downtown Chicago had been cordoned off, mostly bombed out and evacuated. It was a ghost town, nothing living within 40 miles. David rolled up onto his elbows and studied the list. How had that happened? Hadn't the earliest reports said the attack on Illinois had been everything but nuclear? He searched archives, finally pinpointing the day when the GC ruled the city and surrounding areas uninhabitable. Dozens had died from what looked and acted like a radiation poisoning, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta had urged the ruling. Bodies lay decaying in the streets as the living cleared out. Remote probes were dropped into the region to test radiation levels, but their inconclusive reports were attributed to faulty equipment. Soon, no one dared go near the place. Some radical journalists, Buck Williams wannabes, averred on the internet that the abandoning of Chicago was the biggest foul-up in history, that the deadly diseases were not a result of nuclear radiation, and that the place was inhabitable. What if, David wondered? He followed the cyber trails until he was studying the radiation probe results. Hundreds had been attempted. Not one had registered radiation. But once the scare snare was set, the hook had sunk deep. Who would risk being wrong on a matter like that? I might, David thought, with a little more research. He had just studied the skyline of Chicago and became intrigued by the skyscraper that had been built by the late Thomas Strong, who had made his fortune in insurance. The place was a mere 5 years old, a magnificent 80-story tower that had housed Strong's entire international headquarters. Pictures of the aftermath of the bombing showed the top 26 stories of the structure twisting grotesquely away from the rest of the building. The story-high red letters Strong had slid on an angle and were still visible during the daytime, making the place look like a stubborn tree trunk that refused to cave in to the storms that leveled most of the rest of the city. David was about to hack into the blueprints and other records that might show if any of the rest of the structure had been left with any integrity when his laptop beeped, announcing a news bulletin from Global Community Headquarters. His eyes were dancing as it was, so he bookmarked where he had been and determined to go to sleep after checking the bulletin. It read, "A spokesman for Global Community Supreme Commander Leon Fortunato in New Babylon has just announced that the satellite communications have been restored. He asks that citizens employ restraint as so not to overload the system and to limit themselves to only emergency calls for the next 12 hours. The spokesman also had announced the decision reportedly made by Fortunato alone to rename the United Holy Land States. The new name of the region shall be the United Carpathian States, in honor of the slain leader. Fortunato has now announced a successor to his own role as potentate of the region, but such a move is expected under the likelihood that the Supreme Commander he drafted into service as the new global community potentate." David wondered why he had been asked to interfere with telephone capability and someone else had been asked to reverse it. And that is the end of chapter 5. Next, we'll be reading chapter 6. Thank you for joining me. Have a wonderful day.